I'd like to welcome you to day 5 with the Center for Holy Land Studies staff as we talk about the last week of Jesus. But before we jump into day 5, I want to kind of jump back to Thursday evening, if you don't mind. We're going to be speaking about the crucifixion, which is why we have some of these archaeological implements in front of us that we will discuss. But I don't want to skip over Jesus on the Mount of Olives when he was praying that God, please, can you take this cross from me, this end, this outcome. He was still willing to do it, but he was also asking, is there another way that this could possibly happen? And that's the humanness of Jesus, where I would do the same thing. And I think if he did not have this close relationship daily with his Father, I don't know if he'd had the strength to go through with everything that he had to go through, to be honest with you, which I think is important for us to remember, that daily relationship with God is what does enable you to make it through certain things. But if we go back to Jesus, he's praying that this burden could be lifted from him. We know that it isn't. We also know Jesus had full opportunity to escape if he wanted to. The Mount of Olives takes, 15 minutes to walk down if you're slow, I think, and maybe a half hour or so to climb up if you're maybe 45 minutes to climb up if you're in good shape. But on the other side of the Mount of Olives, you have desert, and Jesus could have been gone. And I think if Jesus would have left, the chief priests would have said, see, he ran away. He's not the Messiah. There's nothing to this guy. And they wouldn't have messed with him because he's gone. But he didn't leave. He chose to stay. Yeah, he did choose to stay. It was a choice, and it was a choice, and it was a choice made for us. And he chose that even in face of the temple. The Mount of Olives is here. It's dark, and there's probably campfires everywhere because so many people are staying on it because it's Passover. And the city swelled to probably 3 times. They had to stay somewhere. So many of them would have camped out on the Mount of Olives. Why do you think they had to go and get Judas to find Jesus? It was dark. They weren't going to get Jesus during the day. People loved him. There was no way that people would have let them take Jesus during the day, and they didn't want to seem responsible for what they were going to do to him. So they took him at night, and Judas helped them find him, kissed him on the cheek, and then they took Jesus away. But again, I want to go back to that choice Jesus made. The temple, he could see it from where he was. He knows that's where Isaac was saved from being sacrificed and had a replacement given. And Jesus knew he was not going to have that same end, that he was going to be that sacrifice for us. So in light of that huge decision and personal decision made for all of us, like, that is how much you guys are loved. And it is amazing to think about. But what we really want to focus on too, which is kind of horrible in a way, is the impact of what crucifixion was at that time period. I know that, was it Josephus who said there were bodies wanting for crosses and crosses wanting for bodies? That's how many people were crucified, because it was a way to do really good crowd control. And it kept people quiet. And so that is what they did to Jesus, and it's a Roman way of killing someone, which tells us a lot too about who was responsible for the death of Jesus. So
Romans killing non-Romans.
Oh yeah, yes.
That is the emphasis on that, is that if you are a Roman citizen, like Paul is, the tradition is that Paul is beheaded, which is a quick, clean death, apparently. So they say, I don't know, you don't feel it.
And we don't want to try that today.
But crucifixion was something that was made to be painful, excruciatingly painful, and we'll talk about it. It's where we get that word excruciating from. There's a connection between the crucio there.
And Jesus would have essentially known what was coming.
Oh, absolutely.
That why he was crying out, if there's any other way.
Mm-hmm.
He essentially knew exactly what was coming here in the next few hours.
He did. He did. So we want to maybe bring up some of these implements and talk about what crucifixion did look like at that time. And something I have here, and the way you really began a crucifixion was with beating the person first.
Yeah.
And they used something called a cat of 9 tails, and that they would get this long rope, basically a whip type of thing, with 9 strands hanging from it. And on those strands, they would tie pieces of glass or bone or pottery. And often it was during this beating that people died. Many didn't make it to the cross because how this tore into your body and tore your body apart. And it was until they were tired. It wasn't something of like a 39 lashing. That's kind of a slam on Judaism and trying to blame the Jews, but that wasn't the case. A Roman beating was until they felt like stopping. And then from there, you went on to other parts of the crucifixion experience.
Yeah, absolutely. In some cases, Jesus's case is relatively unique. Pilate is crucifying people on Passover to make a point, because Passover represents the holiday where the people remember being removed from the foreign oppression of Egypt, and Rome is a foreign oppression over them. And so if everybody's coming to Jerusalem to celebrate God's removal of foreign oppression over his people, Rome's kind of scratched its head saying, we've got to do something about this. And part of the reason, as Amy you just said so perfectly, is that most people didn't survive the beating. And I think part of the reason, personally, why Pilate sends Jesus to be flogged so severely, to be scourged, is because if Jesus dies during the scourging, well, whoops, the soldiers did it, I didn't have anything to do. Because Pilate washes his hands. He doesn't really want anything to do with it. But we talked about in day one, we had the Pilate coin. He's the antagonist against the Jewish people.
Yes.
So if he can serve his own means while keeping himself kind of a clean bird in this all...
He's not so great and wonderful.
No, he's part of this whole slide deal of trying to get rid of one problematic Jew, but keeping his image kind of clean inside the eyes of the people, and keeping Caesar off of his back.
Which eventually caught up with him.
Absolutely. He could only do it for so long.
But it does catch up to him.
But you look at the other two, when Jesus is hanging on the cross, Jesus dies very, very early. Crucifixion was something that was dragged out. The whole purpose of it was, as we said, to make an image, and crucifixion was done at eye level, so you could look inside their eyes and see the pain and the life leaving their body. And Josephus tells us that people were left on the cross for days.
Yeah.
And the men,
crowd control.
Absolutely, the men next to Jesus were nowhere near it, beaten so severely. Maybe they were flogged, maybe they were beaten. It doesn't tell us, but they were in no means close to death the way that Jesus was when he was put on the cross. They had to break their legs just simply because it was the Sabbath of Passover.
They needed to get it over
Exactly. That is relatively a merciful death for these people who are hanging on the cross, because they should have been up there significantly longer. But when they get to Jesus, Jesus has been so severely beaten, so much blood has been lost that he's already dead. And that's where they take a spear very, very similar to this, is the first century spearhead that they would have, a Roman soldier would have been carrying at this time. This was not one that was meant for war. This was one that was meant for peacetime, for crowd control, and they would have plugged him with this, and when they pull it out, water comes out showing that he's dead, showing that his bodily functions have finished at that point.
Explain this to me. I find this very interesting.
Yeah.
This is a replica. Unfortunately, this isn't the real thing. The real thing is in the Israel Museum.
Oh, okay.
But this is a ankle bone of somebody who was crucified. And they found it from the first century in an ossuary. And inside this ossuary, you have the nail. It had bent and gotten stuck, but it shows us exactly how they crucified and how common crucifixion really was.
So the nail would have gone through the ankle and not through the top of the foot.
It's, at least in this situation, we find that crucifixion was done many different ways. You find, we have the traditional picture of Jesus on the T-shaped cross, but that isn't always the way that we see crucifixion. Crucifixion was a very, very common way of killing people. We find Julius Caesar crucifying pirates. We find Jews during the first century being crucified. We find slaves who revolt against Rome and the Spartacus revolt being crucified. It was very, very common. And this just shows us one of the ways that it's implemented. It shows us one of the nails, and we have, Travis is holding one right now. You have a Roman nail that is almost an exact match of the size. The thickness of this might have just grown simply because of the oxidation process, but nonetheless, it's not an incredibly massive nail sometimes. It's just a simple nail that goes through, and if you even look at your own, that's all you need, something along that line, and you just get nailed to that cross that you stay. The larger the nail, the more blood loss you're going to have. Remember, they're not looking for the blood loss. They're looking for the prolonged suffering. They're looking for this to be dragged out so that people coming in for the next 3-4 days in the city say, oh, look at that guy. He talked ill of Rome. I better keep my nose clean because Rome's going to do the same thing to me.
And he wouldn't have been high up on a hill.
No.
Like
He would exactly it. It's a very almost a different reality.
Yeah.
Tell me about this.
This is very, very interesting because Psalms 22:8 makes the statement that they will cast lots for my garments. That's exactly what we see happening to Jesus. Is that
it looks like a dice?
It is. They're going to when Jesus is on the cross, they're going to take one of his garments and divide it up into 4 and rip it up and divide it. But then one of his garments is one sheer piece that can't be divided, and so they cast lots for it. And how did a Roman soldier cast lots? It's not the way oftentimes that we think with the Old Testament where you take pottery shards and write everybody's name on it or something and shake them up. What we find with Roman soldiers is that they're constantly playing dice. You don't want your Roman soldiers to get bored, and so you have dice that they would play that we find constantly with different personal belongings to Roman soldiers. And this one specifically is believed to have been a Roman soldier's because it was not made, undoubtedly, by a craftsman. A normal dice from the beginning of time has the opposing ends always having the sum of 7. So 1 and 6 are opposite, 2 and 5 are opposite, 3 and 4. This does not do that. We have 1 and 6, yes, but 4 and 5, 3 and 2.
They messed up a little.
They messed up, which means that it wasn't made by a craftsman. This was probably a Roman soldier who was uneducated, simple, maybe an auxiliary soldier who was trying to get some type of citizenship after a long time. But he is creating this one and incorrectly makes it and carries it on.
Brings us to the casting of lots.
Yeah. This is what they would have been using, a small dice like this, casting the lots.
That's quite something.
Is this wood? Is this rock?
That is bone.
That's
bone.
Bone.
Wow.
Bone will hold a lot longer and take more of a beating because you're throwing this up against other dice all the time than wood will.
So what we've said is basically crucifixion happened a lot, but this one was different, as we all know. And we also know that I don't want to forget to say is that the people loved Jesus. Jesus was taken at night. He was on the cross probably by the time the people were waking up in the morning. A crowd can be even us. It could have been the Sadducees and some of the people with them, the chief priest. They can make up a crowd of people. And they were the ones up doing the trial that wasn't really a trial of Jesus. During the night, that was all taking place.
Yeah.
And by the time Jesus was on his way to or was on the cross, those people were probably finally just waking up, realizing what had just happened. I think otherwise they would have revolted, and because they loved him. We always hear that the people who cried Hosanna cried crucify him. Not the case. Never was that the case.
And keep in mind too, what did we just celebrate yesterday? We celebrated Passover.
Exactly.
And as we learned inside our Passover, wine is a central part of the Passover meal. And so we're thinking about one of their major holidays where the night before they're consuming a significant amount of wine as part of their meal. They're waking up a lot later. They're a little sleepy that day. I kind of think about, for those of you who have kids, I'm sorry, but those of us who don't have kids, Christmas morning after a late Christmas Eve with the family,
wrapping the presents.
you're sleeping in the next morning. It's that kind of that way.
Except if you have the kids.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
I'm blessed. Me and my wife sleep till noon on Christmas Day as of now.
So it's not going to happen much longer. So I guess what I want to say and leave you guys with is that is not the case for Jesus. The people loved him. They hung on his every word, as the Bible says. They believed in his teachings. They followed him. They were with him in the temple. And that's why the chief priests had to take him at night. That is the sole reason. They could have had him any other time. They took him in the evening. And then Jesus was put on the cross, and we know that he died. And it was the evening of Shabbat. And then he was taken to the tomb and laid in the tomb. But that's not the end of the story. So come and join us tomorrow, where we're going to go over what that Saturday looked like in the life of Jesus.